Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Gonzalez, and in this lesson, we're going to look at President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, which is his programs for pulling the United States out of the Great Depression. Let's begin by looking at the election of 1932. As you probably remember from the previous lesson, Herbert Hoover was president when the Great Depression began in 1929. And Hoover was a die-hard believer in American individualism. And this is the idea that America's success as a nation lay in its legacy of hard work and individual effort. And Hoover was very reluctant to do anything to actually help the American people, even as the Great Depression got worse, because he felt that if he did anything to help the American people, that would make them dependent on the government, and that would damage that spirit of individualism that he believed was the key to America's success. Now, for the first 3.5 years of the Great Depression, Hoover did very little to actually help the American people. And the Great Depression continued to get worse. And by 1932, he had become one of the most hated men in the United States. More and more Americans continued to lose their jobs. The economy continued to get worse. And all across the country, you had camps of homeless Americans who that were popping up on the outskirts of towns all across the country. And these were referred to as Hoovervilles. An empty pocket, a pocket with no money in it, turned inside out, was nicknamed a Hoover flag. Hoover was blamed for the country's problems. Now, in 1932, the Republican Party renominated Hoover as their presidential candidate. He was going to run for re-election, and his opponent was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt at the time was the governor of New York, and he was nominated by the Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention, which was meeting in Chicago that year. And when he found out that he had gotten the nomination, he did something that no other president had ever done before. He got on a plane, he flew to the National Convention, and he gave an acceptance speech. And in his acceptance speech, he said that he was pledging himself to a new deal for the American people. And this became the nickname for his plans to pull the country out of the Great Depression. On Election Day, Americans had to choose. Am I voting for Hoover, who is going to continue to do nothing, or at least do very little to help the country, or am I going to vote for Roosevelt, who is going to use the national government to end the Great Depression? And Americans voted overwhelmingly for Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the Electoral College, he won all but 6 of the 48 states. Now, during this time period, Inauguration Day was held in March. So there was a 4-month time period between the election in November and the inauguration. And in the winter of 1932 and 1933, 4,000 banks failed. Around 9 million savings accounts were lost. And this would contribute to the passage of the 20th Amendment. And what the 20th Amendment does is it actually shortens the time period between the election and the inauguration. It shortens it from 4 months to 2 months. Inauguration Day was moved from March 4th to January 20th. And from that time forward, presidential inaugurations have always been held on January 20th. So once FDR was inaugurated in March of 1933, one of the first issues that he had to deal with was a banking crisis. Now, during the first few years of the Great Depression, many Americans had lost confidence in their banks and the American banking system. Thousands of banks had gone out of business. And this was a time before deposit insurance. So if you had money in the bank and your bank went out of business, you simply lost your money. There was no getting it back. And this sometimes resulted in bank runs. So what exactly is a bank run? This is when people run to the bank, they withdraw all of their money, and they take it home and hide it in a place where they think it'll be safe, usually in their mattress or behind a bookshelf. And what's ironic is sometimes so many people would rush to the bank that and they would withdraw so much money that the bank would simply run out of money and would have to shut down. And of course, if you had not gotten to the bank before it shut down, you simply lost your money. Now, in the 4-month period between FDR's election and his inauguration, there was a second wave of bank runs. And this occurred because FDR had indicated while he was running for president that he wanted to take the country off the gold standard. So what exactly is the gold standard? You may remember this from a previous lesson. The gold standard is a system in which the amount of paper money that a country can print is determined by the amount of gold owned by the government. So if the U.S. Treasury owns $1 billion in gold, it can print up to $1 billion in paper money. Also, and this is worth noting, if you had paper money and your government used the gold standard, you could walk into an office of the U.S. Treasury Department and you could exchange your money for gold. You could give them your paper money and they would give you the amount of gold that it was worth. Now, when FDR announced that he wanted to take the country off of the gold standard, this worried a lot of Americans because they felt or they knew that the value of their money was probably going to decrease. If you're not on the gold standard and you can print as much money as you want, that creates inflation and the value of money would go down. So in the 4 months between FDR's election and his inauguration, people are running to the banks, they're withdrawing their money, and some of them are taking it to the Treasury Department to exchange it for gold. So, and during this time period, like I said in the previous slide, around 4,000 banks actually fail. They have to shut down, and around 9 million savings accounts are wiped out. So once he is in office, FDR declares a bank holiday. He shuts down all the banks in the nation. And within 5 days, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Now, what this law did, one, it did take the country off the gold standard. But two, it said that no bank in the country could reopen unless it had received the stamp of approval from the U.S. Treasury Department. So the Treasury Department was sending inspectors, and they were making sure that the nation's banks were financially stable. And if they received a certificate, these banks were allowed to reopen. Now, the night before the banks were due to reopen, FDR spoke to the American people using the radio. And this was the first of what he called his fireside chats. Now, why would he call them fireside chats? He wasn't speaking from next to a fireplace. He was speaking from behind his desk in the White House. Well, it was over radio. People didn't know that. And he wanted people to picture him as this fatherly or grandfatherly type figure sitting next to the fireplace and telling them that everything was going to be all right. And he assured that the American people that Any bank that reopened the next day had his stamp of approval, and it was safe to put their money back into it. And he did succeed in restoring their confidence. Over the next month or so, around $1 billion was placed back into the nation's banks. And with that, the banking crisis had come to an end.